So in this second video on nervous control, what we're going to do is focus more on how the body communicates and then carries out an action. So this is under the title of nerve pathways and how nerves link together to then bring about any kind of movement or any kind of decision or response to something. So nerve pathways are made up of a few different parts, and I'm going to run through the diagram and then summarize it at the end. So for example, in this diagram that I've given you, I've got the brain, spinal cord down the middle, and then we have these big long nerve projections which are shown on what would be an example of a leg. This would be an example of an arm. So for example, if you had an area in your skin that was tickled, you would then feel that, and you'd feel that because you have areas on your skin and in all your other sense organs called sensory receptors. And now they're called receptors because they receive information, and these are on the skin. Now you don't just have receptors for touch, you have receptors for pain or heat or cold or damp or dry. And what these will do is these will detect a stimulus. Now a stimulus is something that your body wants to respond to. And in this example, it's the hair on the leg being tickled. Okay, so when that hair on the leg is tickled, those sensory receptors, these little dots here that I've shown in the diagram, these then are triggered. Now what they do is they then are triggered to send an impulse along a neuron. And that neuron is called the sensory neuron because it basically links to a sensory receptor in a sense organ. Your skin is a sense organ, your nose, your mouth, and your ears are sense organs. But in this example, we're talking about the skin. So what it would do, what would happen is each of these receptors would send off a signal, and that signal would go along a sensory neuron. Now that sensory neuron wants to bring that impulse and that message up and towards the brain. Okay, so an impulse, this bit here, is sent along a sensory neuron. Right here. Now it's sent upwards to the brain. Now the brain here on the diagram is just labelled now. Your brain decides what to do with that. So your brain processes information. So it takes that information in, it processes it. Okay, from that sensory neuron. And it makes a decision as to what to do about that. Okay, on a response for that. Now if you think that someone's tickled your leg or something has tickled your leg, what your response would be is to scratch it. So your brain decides to tell your body to scratch it. Now how it does that is it sends an impulse down another neuron. Okay, so it's no longer a sensory neuron because sensory neurons connect sensory organs and sensory receptors to the brain. This time what it's going to do is send an impulse down a different neuron that's called the motor neuron. So the brain decides what to do and it sends an impulse down a motor neuron. Okay, so an impulse is sent along the motor neuron. Now motor refers to movement. Okay, like a motor car. So a motor neuron often brings about movement because it relates to links to what's called an effector. So this diagram here has an effector. Now an effector receives that impulse. Okay, now that effector in the example in this one would be a muscle. but it could also be a gland. Okay, so for example, if your body's too hot and your brain decides that it needs to make you sweat, you would then have a gland that would produce sweat. For this example, what it's telling the body to do is actually contract the muscle and respond to that tickling by scratching it. So the effector, in this case the muscle, receives that impulse, and the effector brings about a response. Okay, and in this example, that response would be to scratch the itch. Okay, and it scratches the itch by contracting the muscles in the hand. Okay, so if we start from the beginning, you have a stimulus, which is where your hair on your leg is tickled. And that stimulus, that thing that your body needs to respond to, is received by the sensory receptors. So they pick up this information and they'll send it as an electrical impulse along the sensory neuron, so up into your brain. Now the brain then has to process that and decide whether it wants to respond or whether it wants to do anything about it, and makes a decision on what that response will be. Now once it's decided on the response, it sends an impulse down along a motor neuron. Okay, and that motor neuron connects to what's called an effector, which in this case is a muscle, which receives that impulse and then brings about a response. Okay, so if your leg is tickled, you then decide to scratch the itch. Okay, and that response then is bringing that hand down and then scratching that itch. Now this example could be applied to, well, this diagram could be applied to many examples. So for example, if you drive by McDonald's and you smell McDonald's, and that sensory receptors in your nose will smell the McDonald's, and your brain will decide what you want to do with that. So your brain will process that information from that smell of McDonald's and then decide whether you want to turn back and go to McDonald's, and it'll tell your effectors to turn around and start walking that way. Or what it'll decide to do is keep walking and then not go to McDonald's. Okay? So in that example, your stimulus would be the smell of McDonald's, detected by the sensory receptors in your nose. Okay, and it's going to pass that impulse along to your central nervous system, your brain and your spinal cord. And it's going to pass that message along, that impulse along, on a sensory neuron. Now that sensory neuron carries that impulse to your central nervous system, to your brain. Your brain processes it and decides whether it wants to go to McDonald's. And then if it decides to do that, it will send an impulse to your effectors, okay, which could be your muscle, and it will send that along a motor neuron. Now in this example, your effector could also be your salivary glands. So if you walk by McDonald's and you smell it, your brain will decide what to do, and it might tell your salivary glands to start salivating. So you start drilling and you want to go to McDonald's. So your effector could either be a muscle, which would contract and turn you around to go to McDonald's, or it could be your glands to cause you to start drilling. Okay, and then those effectors bring about a response. And this is an overview of nerve pathways. The next video we'll talk about reflex actions, which is ones that are much faster than this, ones that don't involve conscious thought.